Thank you, Aliyah, for making this event possible. And thank you very much for partnering with Brittle Paper to co-host this event. This event is special to me because it's part of a series of commemorative events in celebration of Brittle Paper's 10-year anniversary. And for those who do not know Brittle Paper, it is an online magazine on African writing and literary culture. A few months ago, when we began drawing up the program for the commemoration, we knew we wanted to highlight a decade-defining event. And we settled on this particular event having to do with the Chibok girls and their kidnapping, because we wanted an event that wasn't literary, but was sort of significant enough to have inspired literary responses. And so here we are. I want to thank Neil Kodesh, who is the faculty director of the African Studies program here. And of course, special thanks goes to Aliyah and her brilliant team for being so supportive these many weeks. The format for today's event is slightly different from what you might be used to. Instead of an academic panel where papers are presented, we will use a book festival format where a moderator engages conversations among panelists. So I will essentially be asking the panelists questions and kind of guide us through the conversation surrounding our particular topic. And today we're talking about the Chibok girls, the Bring Back Our Girls hashtag. And we want to think about what it tells us about the persistence of gender-based and systemic violence, but also how the process of documenting these events these past few years has sort of opened up a space for the possibility for healing. We have enough time, so there's no need to rush. At some point in the conversation, the creative writers on the panel are going to do a short reading of their work. And after that, we might have a little bit more discussion, and then we're going to open the floor for questions and comments. And as we're getting closer to that time, I will let everyone know so that you can begin to gather your thoughts and comments. We have a stellar panel today in front of us. I'll begin with introducing Adaobi Tricia Nwaubani. She's a novelist, journalist, and essayist based in Abuja, Nigeria. Her reportage and essays have appeared in scores of publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Guardian. She writes a monthly column for the BBC's Letter from Africa, also broadcast on the Focus on Africa radio program. She was a location producer for the BBC HBO documentary film Stolen Daughters Kidnapped by Boko Haram. And she was a recipient of the 2019 Carter Journalism Institute Reporting Award. Tricia, Adaobi, thank you very much for being here today. Abdulbasit Kassim is a PhD candidate at the University of, at Rice University in the Department of Religion. And he's also a visiting doctoral fellow at the Institute of Islamic Thought in Africa at Northwestern University. His primary field of research is Islam and Africana studies. Abdulbasit's first book, The Boko Haram Reader, From Nigerian Preachers to the Islamic State, was published by Hurst and Oxford University in 2018. Abdulbasit, thank you so much for being here. Mona Eltahawy is an award-winning columnist and international public speaker on Arab and Muslim issues and global feminism. She's based in Cairo and New York City. She's the author of Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution. And she also wrote 7 Necessary Saints for Women and Girls, which came out last year. She's also a contributor to the New York Times opinion pages Her commentaries have appeared in several other publications, and she's a regular guest analyst on various television and radio shows. Titilope, Mona, thank you very much for being here. Titilope Sonuga is a writer and performer whose work has graced stages and pages across the world. Through her practice, she grasps for moments of tenderness and persistent joy at the intersection of Blackness and womanhood. She's the author of 3 collections of poetry, Down to Earth, Abscess, which came out in 2014, and This Is How We Disappear, which came out last year. And she's also written plays. You can also find her debut album, I think, Swim. No, it's not a debut. I think she's had other albums before, but she has this gorgeous poetry album on Spotify, iTunes, and all the major streaming platforms called Swim. And I think it's gorgeous and inspiring and beautiful. Thanks so much for our panelists for agreeing to be here. Let me begin by just briefly speaking about the context for the key driving themes for the panel today. One thing that ties these panelists together is an unfortunate event that rocked the world. On April 14th, 2014, a band of men came to a girls' boarding school in a farming town in the northeast of Nigeria called Chibok, and kidnapped 276 girls, 276 students, carrying them off to the Sambisa forest. The Nigerian insurgent group Boko Haram was responsible for the kidnapping. But the Nigerian government, led by President Goodluck Jonathan, was slow to addressing the issue. As a result, on the 23rd of April, a series of events led to the launching of the now popular hashtag #BringBackOurGirls, which some of you are probably familiar with. By the next day, the hashtag had garnered over 14,000 tweets, and in the next few weeks, it was going to garner about a few million tweets. With the Nigerian government still refusing to kind of take a public and decisive stand about this dastardly event, certain powerful women went into action, led by a former Nigerian minister, Obi Ezekwesili. And they staged protests and marches in Abuja. Celebrities like Michelle Obama and Beyonce helped to amplify the voices of those calling for the Nigerian government to rescue these girls from these brutally violent men. Some of the girls have since come back home due to negotiations between the Nigerian government and Boko Haram, but many of them remain missing. Imagine the pain and loss in the households and the communities where these girls are from. The event shocked Nigeria and stunned the world, not just because of the scale of the crime. How do you march into a secondary school and kidnap people, girls? But also for how it exemplifies entrenched forms of patriarchal violence. So much is heartbreaking about the story, but it demonstrates what Eltahawy refers to as, quote, the daily terrorism of girls and women, which she says is global and so rampant that, quote, it is akin to the air we breathe. We take it for granted and we rarely think about it. In the years that followed, writers tried to make sense of the girls' kidnap. Everyone on this panel, with the exception of Eltahawy, has written about this particular incident. Abdulbasit's first book, The Boko Haram Reader, From Nigerian Preachers to the Islamic State, presents a genealogy of the Boko Haram phenomenon. Adaobi's Beneath the Baobab Tree is a young adult fiction inspired by the events of April 14, 2014. Titilope's poetry collection, This Is How We Disappear, is a powerful poetic response to the history of violence against female bodies implied in the event, and the necessity of finding ways to heal. And even though Mona's work does not directly engage with this particular incident, her book, 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, provide the feminist theoretical background for unpacking some of the larger resonances of this event. And for those who are interested in this story and the archives being built around it, you could also look into Helen Habila's journalistic reportage, Chibok Girls, and Isha Sesay's memoir, really, really moving memoir, Beneath the Tamarind Tree, A Story of Courage, Family, and the Law School Girls of Boko Haram. I'm hoping that today we can speak honestly and earnestly about this event and just kind of figure out what it tells us about our world today and what insights have we gained from, the bit of distance from the event. So welcome to our panelists. And I will begin with a question for Adaobi. So Adaobi, we know that 1 year after the event, after the girls were taken, you returned to Chibok for a journalistic project. And you actually got to meet the bereaved parents and the communities. Can you tell us about that experience?
Sorry, I just went up for a moment.
No worries.
Sorry, I missed your question, please.
So I was saying that you went to Chibok about a year after the event. And you were there on a journalistic project. And that you actually got to meet bereaved parents and members of the community. I wanted to see if you could tell us about what that was like, going back and then actually meeting these parents and talking to them about this really painful experience.
Well, between 2014 and today, I've done at least 8 different trips to Chibok. So I've seen the parents at different times. I've seen them before, when the kidnapping was still fresh in everybody's mind. I've seen them when some of their daughters were found, were rescued. I've seen some of the parents who watched other people's daughters return and theirs didn't return. I've spoken with parents whose daughters I know are dead, but I can't tell them they are dead because the government and the executives of the Chibok Association have agreed with the girls who returned not to share that information with the parents. So I've done a number of trips, and each time speaking with the parents at different stages of their grief. I think for me, because I live in Nigeria, obviously, and to people in many parts of Nigeria, what is happening in the Northeast is so distant and so unbelievable, to a lot of people. And so going to Chibok to meet the people these things are happening to and seeing the reality, because I meet people every day who still don't believe those events are real. Those things didn't happen. But it's just, I go there and I just wish I could transport as many stories as possible and just spread them around the world. So that's the first thing that's the main feeling I have. Like, how do I get the world to hear these people's stories? And I've seen their feelings metamorphose. I've seen them get to the point where they felt abandoned. I mean, they couldn't understand the fact that at some point, every journalist on earth wanted to speak with a Chibok parent, and all of a sudden, nobody's interested in them. They're calling every day with things that they think will interest us. And we're having to apologize. I'm sorry, nobody's ready to publish, nobody's too keen on this story today. So I've just watched the metamorphoses of, watched their feelings change over time, watch the interest of the public wane over time, watch the publicity and the celebrity interest vanish. I've just seen all various aspects of this story. So each time I go, or each of the times I've gone, it's just about harvesting the stories as they are and disseminating them raw and real and fresh.
Yeah, I mean, just a little follow-up to that. Is there something that came out in your engagement with these communities and these families that didn't quite make it to the mass media, right? Is there a part of the story that was missed in all the kind of media interest? around
Well,
it?
there are always things that either you discovered and realize that you don't need to bother telling this aspect of the story. And there are things that I have what I would call almost an obsession with hearing every side of a story. Like I hear a story and I want to hear every single side of it. And even when I was listening to you make the introductory speech, there were things you said which are popular beliefs in the media, but I know are not quite accurate. For example, people say the popular impression is that former President Goodluck Jonathan did nothing. I mean, I have no affiliation whatsoever to his government, but I know that's not true. They did so much, so much. But the world was intent on, making the activists look like the superstars and the government look like the devil. So everything they did was, yes, maybe they could have done more to publicize what they did, perhaps. But I know from speaking with parents, interviewing government officials, seeing records, government records, speaking with parents involved, I know how much that administration did. I know how much this administration is doing. So, has done up until the point I stopped covering the story. So there are just so many things that come out of it. I meet with girls who return from, Chibok girls who were kidnapped and returned to their homes. And I meet girls who, tell me, I hear aspects of the story that, not one girl, very few girls, I'll say very few. I mean, I haven't spoken to every single girl, but I've spoken with dozens of them. And very few of them have anything negative to say about the Boko Haram militants. So these are just aspects of the story that, yes, I'm telling you. In fact, they will tell you, Auntie, nothing bad happened in the forest. They say it over and over again. So you find out that it's a really complicated story, especially because the Bring Back Our Girls campaign was both positive and negative. It was good in the sense that it brought attention. It pressured the Nigerian government to do more than they had ever done. And in the process, more than 30,000 girls who are not Chibok girls were freed. So these girls had been kidnapped, some of them more than a year before the Chibok girls were kidnapped. But nobody knew about them. The world wasn't bothered. And then this Chibok thing happened and the world sort of was interested. So the Nigerian military went the extra mile and got more than 30,000 girls released. And then, so we have the Chibok girls. But then because of the spotlight on the Chibok girls, the Boko Haram men were very careful. They protected the girls, made sure they were always at the same places as the commanders were. So it became more difficult to find them because of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. That campaign was great. As I say, it has a lot of positives and it did a lot. But because of that campaign, these girls are not back today. So because all the Chibok girls that were freed were either through negotiations or one or two who escaped with the help of their husbands or that kind of thing. But the others are kept, over time, while the girls were there before, more recently things have changed, but they were always kept with the high commanders. And the commanders were given the instruction to flee when the army is coming, abandon your own wives and take these girls with you. So you see, these are aspects of the story that, yes, we try to tell them, but we may not focus on them too much, because I know the world did what they did with the best of intentions, but there were so many repercussions that we didn't expect, so many consequences of the campaign that backfired, especially on the parents, on the girls. They came back, they were freed, and they were not free enough to live their normal lives. The government was so terrified of anything else happening to them. So the girls were locked up, even where they are in their school. The Nigerian government is paying so much to have them educated at the American University of Nigeria in Yola. But the girls are not allowed outside the campus. They are not allowed to mix with the other students because the government is so terrified, and the school as well, that these girls are so precious that anything could happen to them. Imagine if somebody kidnaps a girl who was freed, a Chibok girl. So these are just the consequences. So the girls are in school and they're trapped. They can't go anywhere. They can't mix with anyone. So they're free, but not free. I wrote an article about it for the New York Times that I think they titled it "Too Famous to Be Free" or something like that. So these are the consequences of the Bring Back Our Girl campaign. Great as it was, fantastic as it was, but these are aspects of the story that are given less focus or less emphasis when we have the conversation.
Yeah, we're going to talk about kind of the complicated celebrity that came, through the hashtag and its global spread. But before we move on, what was it like for parents who are kind of caught between these two somewhat complementary, but also conflicting forces, the government versus the Bring Back Our Girls movement? Like, was it a difficult position for the parents to be in?
You know, that's another thing. Again, you know, sometimes I feel uncomfortable telling the stories, but most of the time, the parents in Chibok, you know, they had Chibok parents in Abuja. They had a few parents, maybe two of them or so, who were always the face of the campaign here in Abuja. They always went for the marches and the gatherings at the, you know, the Freedom Fountain here in Abuja. But and then we have the parents in Chibok who are really the majority, and you know, so those parents in Chibok actually found the campaign as a hindrance. They all the time they felt, especially like the parents felt these people were hindering their relations with the government, for example, right. Because the government, a lot of times the government had to go through people like us, journalists, to link with the parents. Even until today, the parents call me if they need help with getting a message to the presidency or to the government, that kind of thing, because they just, sometimes they'll go for meetings with the president, and they'll have Bring Back Our Girls campaigners with them. And the parents will afterwards tell me that they didn't like the way the campaigners were talking to the president. That's not the way they wanted to speak to him. They had different things to say. So we saw all that happening. So the parents watched that. I mean, the campaign was helpful, no doubt about it. It brought the spotlight to them. Nobody would have known about, you know, the world would probably have forgotten about them. The Nigerian government would have forgotten about them if not for the campaigns. But even after they got the attention of the world, they began to suffer. They felt the campaigners were a burden to them. I got that complaint over and over and over again. It got to the point the Chibok parents, and they will constantly say, they'll hear something said in the media and they'll call me, can you please put it out in the media that we didn't say that? That's not our opinion. They're not speaking for us. You know, we had all those kinds of experiences. So it was really complicated. It's been a really complicated story to observe and to report on.
Yeah. Thank you for those insights. Mona, so just kind of to go on with this idea of what could people in power have done differently, okay? So it's certainly interesting to know that the Nigerian government did something, right? And they had to, right, after their hands were tied, right? But it took time for them to actually wade in. I mean, if 276 girls go missing, you don't sleep on that. You know, it's an emergency of all kinds, human rights, political, just whatever. But they took their time. That, I don't know why, maybe Basit can kind of weigh in later. Is it that they thought it will blow over? But there's a sense that it was difficult to actually convey that this is an emergency. From your work, just in kind of thinking a lot about the banality of violence against women globally, what would you say accounts for this kind of refusal, or refusal to kind of see why it is absurd and exceptional and not okay that 260 girls were kidnapped?
First of all, thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel, especially because as an Egyptian, it's really important for me that I speak with fellow Africans about issues like this, because there's such an artificial and unnecessary divide between so-called North Africa and the rest of the continent. And I was in Cairo when these terrible events happened, and I remember very well, you know, the shock and the horror that I felt, and that I shared with Nigerian feminist sisters and comrades and Nigerians generally. So I'm honored to be a part of this discussion. And I think to answer your question, I would begin with how I begin all my presentations, which is to say, my name is Mona Eltahawy, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and my declaration of faith is fuck the patriarchy, because that declaration of faith explains exactly what happened and why it happened. And you know, whether we're asking why the girls were kidnapped or why the government took so long to react, I think the answer to all of that is it's because they were girls. And we have to also ask before, why did it take for the government so long to react? What has been happening to girls every day in Nigeria and across the world, of course, not just in Nigeria, because patriarchy is universal. But what kind of crimes are committed against girls every day that would then lead to this horrific event? Because it doesn't happen overnight that armed militants like Boko Haram come and kidnap hundreds, dozens and dozens of girls. That doesn't happen overnight. some patriarchal fuckery, as I call it, has prepared the way to this. And, you know, listening to what our previous panelist was just saying about all the different arguments that were happening between the family and the government and the armed militants, it's a reminder that this idea of protection and girls and who speaks for the girls is a reminder of the daily acts of violence that girls are subjected to. Again, not just in Nigeria, but everywhere. And if we look at the weakest link in any society, it will be the girl. Whether we're talking about the pandemic today and who it affects the most, or who is most affected by armed militancy, or who is most affected by government neglect. And it's always the girl. But the girl is always the one we hear the last about. So I think what happened with these particular horrific events is that they were so horrific that they shook us into attention. But I guarantee that every day something terrible happens to a girl in Nigeria, as it does in Egypt, as it does in the United States. So the fact that what happened in this particular incident magnified the horror and made the whole world pay attention, I use that in my books and in my writing and in my activism generally to ask people, why does it take something so horrific to make you pay attention to the daily horrors that girls are subjected to? And this idea of the government must protect the girls against armed militants who are hurting girls, when we know that there are other forms of harms that are being visited upon the girls that the government don't protect the girls from.
Mm-hmm.
This reminds you of what I say when I say people don't understand that asking someone what is patriarchy is like asking a fish what is water. The fish would look at you as if you're speaking another language. What are you talking about? Water is the very air or the water I breathe. So I think this is what we have to, this is what my entry point is, that the fact that the weakest link in all societies, and especially in this case, is the girl.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, and gesturing to the idea that this is not something that happened overnight, right? That there were other existing cultural, political, economic forces that kind of set the scene up first for this to happen, and then to kind of stage all the complications that Adaobi talked to us about, right, around the incidents. And so that's perhaps a good place for Abdulbasit to maybe help us step back a little bit and tell us about this group, Boko Haram. You know, what's the face behind this just absolutely dastardly act, and what may have been some of the forces that led to their emergence, but also they are staging this particular act.
Yes, thank you so much for having me for this event. And thank you so much as well for the contribution of other panelists. I have to say that Boko Haram as a subject is something that is so difficult to study. It's difficult to study on multiple levels. I started studying Boko Haram around 2010. Before then, I studied in northern Nigeria. I did my undergraduate in northern Nigeria, and I was active in the religious milieu. So I had the opportunity prior to 2009, before the group went violent. I had the opportunity of listening to the group's leader who was killed in 2009. I had the opportunity of listening to him in person. He came to a mosque in Kaduna State, where I was studying at that time, and he came to deliver a lecture. And I had an opportunity to listen to him. At the time I started studying Boko Haram, one major thing that was very important for me is ideas. For me, I'm actually very passionate about understanding people's ideas and how ideas actually affect or shape people's action. Because most times, I'm always very interested in getting into people's brain, in understanding how they think, because the moment you understand how a person thinks or the type of ideas that shape a person's worldview, you can always predict how the person will act. So for me, I wasn't really too surprised. As shocking, as painful as the Chibok girls kidnapping event was, I was not really surprised by it for so many reasons. Number one, before 2009, the group's leader, Mohammed Yusuf, the leader of Boko Haram, Mohammed Yusuf, who was killed in 2009, had already spoken about slavery. He spoke about this particular event of Chibok. One thing about Boko Haram is whatever action that people see that they engage in, number one, they usually speak about it before they even act upon it. That's number one. Mm-hmm. Number two, they always try to find ideas, whether historical ideas or whether historical ideas from history, religious ideas, to sanctify and justify that particular action. So in the case of Chibok, for example, in 2008, the leader of Boko Haram, who was killed in 2009, he actually spoke about how the group will engage in slavery. And Mohammed Yusuf at that time, he actually said that that slavery is sanctioned in Islam. I mean, I'm quoting him verbatim here. He says slavery is actually sanctioned by Islam, and that the moment they establish a theocratic state, they're going to engage in slavery. And then he tried to also tie that action as well to history, because usually many people focus on the contemporary events, but I always say that the contemporary events do not happen out of a vacuum. It's always very important to ask three questions. Where are we coming from? Where exactly are we coming from? I mean, what exactly has been happening in terms of some of these issues of slavery and girl child, violence against girl child? What is that? Where are we coming from? Now, by the time we understand history, by the time we understand memory, now we will now understand how we got to where we are, which was actually the events. So for Boko Haram, Mohammed Yusuf has actually spoken about this event, like I said, in 2008. And Shekau, the current, one of the factional leader of the group, he only acted upon what they had initially planned to do. But then, when Shekau did that particular action, he did something that most people often overlook. Now, Shekau actually said, and I'm quoting him verbatim, he said that the current aristocratic structure in northern Nigeria do not have the legitimacy and authority to actually critique his kidnapping of the girls. And he said that's because this is exactly what the Emirates, virtually all the Emirates, all the aristocratic institutions in northern Nigeria, this is exactly what they've actually been doing in history. I mean, this is a region where people are being, this is a region that has a fatal history of enslavement, especially of girl child. I mean, this is a region that actually has where concubinage, royal slavery. And to be honest with you, sometimes when I listen to how people critique, how people speak about the event, I see a lot of duplicity in this event as well, in the way people discuss about it. Duplicity in the sense that, I mean, people critique Shekau and they critique Boko Haram for kidnapping the girls, but then some of the people, especially the aristocratic institution that critique the girls, that critique this event, they also have some slaves in their emirates. I mean, they have some slave some girl child that are being kept as slaves, and concubinage and all of these things. So there's a lot of complicated history to this very event, and I think to really understand the Chibok event, and even not just the Chibok event, I mean, so many other events associated with Boko Haram, it's always very important to trace the evolution of the group from history to understand what has been happening over time. Now, I won't say that there's one dimensional or one narrative of history, because history itself is multi-layered. There's so many events that have been happening in the region. This is the same region where this is the same region where we've had leaders and scholars who actually advocated for girl-child education. I mean, I always say something that as critical, no matter how critical one can be of leaders in northern Nigeria, I mean, of historical leaders in northern Nigeria, people like Nwaubani, the Sokoto Caliphate, and some of these aristocratic institutions, no matter how critical one can be of their legacy, they also have some positive as well. Nwaubani, for example, I mean, he is actually one of the pioneers of girl-child education. He wrote extensively in his literature, in his books, on the need and the importance of educating the girl child. His children, his female children, were scholars in their own right. He promoted education. But then, as golden, as brilliant as this legacy, we also have the other aphotic side of history, which is the history of enslavement of girls and others. And then it's also very important to understand, lastly, to understand that Boko Haram, they also situated this event around religious memory as well. So one of the memory that Boko Haram actually tapped into, which unfortunately has been the memory that has been haunting Nigeria over the decades, especially in the Middle Belt, in Northwest as well as Northeast Nigeria. This old memory of us versus them, us ordering, the ordering narrative. Ordering narrative in the sense that Boko Haram actually justified that the Chibok event on the basis of religion. That, because they declared a theocratic state, then they gave themselves that mandate to actually go out there and enslave girls. And in the case of Leah Sharibo, which I think is very important here, I mean, a case is important because it also shows the symbolism of religion in the entire kidnapping of girls. Because in the case of Leah Sharibo, for example, I mean, Boko Haram actually emphasized that it's only when the girls convert to Islam, that is when they can become free. Now, some of these religious issues, unfortunately, they are often swept under the radar, and people don't really engage with them. And it's also, I think, another reason why people don't engage in this discourses is also because of the fear of being tagged as promoting Islamophobic narrative. So because of the fear of Islamophobia, oftentimes the religious dimension of the entire insurgency, the entire narrative of kidnapping of the girls is often swept under the radar. But then this religious narrative is where Boko Haram actually anchor its events. Even though they might have other motifs, they might have other reasons why they do their action, they always provide religious legitimacy to back whatever they're doing. And I think, I'm so personally myself, I'm very fatigued of talking about Boko Haram. I mean, because I have personally suffered from vicarious trauma just watching what was happening. I mean, I've been to Northeast Nigeria, I've been to Yobe State, I've been to Borno State, I've spoken to some of the victims of the violence. I didn't experience the violence in person, but I have to say that just sitting down, watching the movements, or watching the Boko Haram movement, watching their videos, watching everything that's been unfolding for the last decade, I have personally suffered from vicarious trauma. I mean, it has affected my own psyche as well. And I'm personally so irritated, I have to say, about the way that so many issues that I think are germane and are very, very important to be discussed are often swept under the radar, and then other peripheral issues are being accentuated.
Yeah, I mean, this is a group that has been around for a while, and for quite a while, the Nigerian government underestimated them, right? And it seemed like it was an obscure group, right? Because, you know, in Nigeria, there are always some group that pops up and that wants something, right? And then they fizzle out. But then something about this group kept them going, kept them consolidating their power, kept them relevant. I mean, what would you say, what changed? What was the shift from just an obscure militia group to a clear and present danger to the Nigerian state? Was there any historical shift that kind of anchored that change?
Well, I would say that Boko Haram was never an obscure group. It was never an obscure group. Boko Haram had presence in the religious public sphere. I mean, the leaders of Boko Haram were people that they actively traveled across northern Nigeria to do preaching openly. The leaders of Boko Haram also had a series of debates with other religious scholars in northern Nigeria. This was prior to 2009. It was in 2009 that Boko Haram actually went underground and then it became a guerrilla and insurgent group. But one thing that we also have to understand is that some of the ideas that Boko Haram actually preach, they are not new ideas in the northern Nigerian religious milieu. I mean, ideas about Western education being forbidden or being, these are all tied to colonial experience. These ideas have been there for ages. Ideas about wanting to establish a theocratic state. Boko Haram is not the first group to promote or postulate that idea in the northern Nigerian religious milieu. So many other movements have actually challenged secularism. They've challenged the whole idea of democracy. They've challenged the whole idea of constitutionalism. All of these movements have been there. In fact, the leaders, it's so surprising actually, because the leaders of some of these other movements that have actually promoted some of these ideas are now the ones in de-radicalization programs today. They are now the one, I mean, most of them have changed their beliefs on all of this issue. But I would say that what was very significant in the case of Boko Haram is Boko Haram was one of the group in the recent history of northern Nigeria that actually took their ideas from the realm of abstraction to the realm of pragmatism. So in the case of other movements, they were only proselytizing their ideas in the public sphere. So usually I usually have like a continuum of explaining this movement. So in the first continuum are movements who are always preaching for Islamic reform. I mean, this movement always claim that, the current state is a state of profanity, secularism is evil. Some of those groups in the first continuum, the continuum of reformist movements, these groups actually want a change in the status quo. They want a Puritan reform. Now, some movements do not stop at preaching reform alone. They also transit to the realm of dissidence. So dissidence is when the movement actively starts engaging in verbal antagonism against the states. So in this case, I mean, we could see it in the case of, for example, the IMN, who are being the Islamic movements of Nigeria, who are currently facing a lot of altercation with the Nigerian government. So some of this movement in the realm of dissidence, they actively engage in antagonism against the national anthem, against national symbols in general, because they believe that all of those symbols are antithetical to their understanding of Islam. And then in the final continuum are groups that actually engage in actual rebellion. So a movement moved from preaching reform, to becoming a dissident movement, to engaging in actual rebellion. So Boko Haram is the first movement in the recent history of northern Nigeria that actually got to this final stage of rebellion. Other movements, when they got to the level of dissidence, they retracted because the government reacted to them, and the government sent some of their leaders. The government gave punitive measure to some of their leaders. So some of them actually retracted, and they never furthered their campaign. Some of them also, they became part of the government as well. I mean, in fact, today, sometimes when I look at the milieu, I mean, today we have a minister, for example, in Nigeria, who, I mean, some of his utterances in the past, I mean, they actually do not qualify for someone like that to be a minister. But then it also shows how the fluidity of religious ideas, how some ideas get to a particular stage of dissidence and then people retract back. But Boko Haram, in conclusion, was actually the first movement that moved from preaching reform to dissidence and then to actual rebellion. So Boko Haram did not do anything really, really new.
I see. Well, thank you for weighing in on that. Titilope, your book came out in 2019. That's 5 years after the event. At what points did you kind of go from being an onlooker, you know, an observer of these events happening, to deciding that it demanded a poetic response and kind of crafting a book project out of it?
So I was, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I feel really honored to be a part of this conversation. And even as I sit here, I'm enlightened and just inspired by all the other panelists. So I was living in Lagos in 2014. In fact, since 2013, it happened in 2014. I was in Lagos at the time. And like Adaobi said, it felt like Chibok might as well have been on another planet. There's a way in which Lagos kind of orbits around itself, and there's a kind of self-centered Lagos way of being. But this was something that definitely pushed through. And I remember even then, and always as a Nigerian citizen, being acutely aware of how you are on your own, how you are your own government, how you are your own political system, how you govern your own life. And this has been a thread that has run through our history, but I think for the first time, I became acutely and intimately aware of what the value of the lives of women and girls were in Nigeria in a way that terrified me anew. I knew it molecularly, but I think to observe how the government responded or didn't respond to this event was, I looked on with childish bewilderment as this was happening. And I know that one of my larger fears at the time, and as always as an artist, is the power of forgetting and the power of things being pushed back into our memory until they no longer exist. So the book came out in 2019, but these are poems I've been haunted by since this event happened. And I had been writing and rewriting and exploring and thinking about. I became haunted and obsessed. I remember pouring myself into articles that I read, and I was afraid of the idea of these girls disappearing, disappearing into the brand of Chibok, disappearing into this global hashtag, this movement that kind of swallowed up who they were to their parents. I remember combing through articles, and there are poems in the book that are found poems, because I would read and read things from the parents in particular, things they would say about the color of a hijab or a smile or a laugh. And those were the things that I cared about the most, because over and beyond this grand disappearance, this brand of Chibok are these human beings who are loved by somebody and who had been taken from these people that love them. And I was listening while Adaobi spoke and remembered her mentioning that the girls had come back and said that nothing bad happened. And one of the things that I was preoccupied by was this idea of the coming back. So the missing is one part, but what happens when they come back? Who are they when they come back? What do they come back to? And how are they affected by these events that have happened to them? And part of what the book explores is this idea of violence as more than a physical act, as violence as also psychological and persistent and continuous. And so the Chibok disappearance is sort of the nucleus of this book, but it started to because I became obsessed and haunted by this, it started to spill into every area of my life. Everywhere I looked, everywhere I spoke, I became consumed by this idea of the many ways that women disappear into their minds, into their bodies, the ways that we disappear in the world. I wanted to connect it back even to the disappearance of Indigenous women here in Canada. This is a thing that is not localized. It is not a Chibok sensation, but this is the world over. And so I was sitting with these poems for a very long time. And I think always, you asked how I moved from being an observer to wanting to write about this stuff. I think always as an artist, there is this balancing of things where art is at once frivolous and useless, but also absolutely necessary. Artists are the keepers of memory. I always imagine that when we are long gone, they will dig up these manuscripts and these books, and this is how they will know how we lived our lives. It felt strange and it felt strange for me not to write about this. And it felt strange for me at the time as a woman, and at the time I was pregnant with my now son, as a mother, to not, in my time here, contribute my voice to this story, and to contribute it in a way that humanized these people, that gave them names, that gave them place in the world beyond the headlines and the hashtags. There was no version of events in which I wasn't going to in which I was going to remain a silent observer. There was no version of events in which my work, in whatever form, does not become something that is used in service of. And so I think this was always going to happen, either in this book or the next, or the one after that, because I continue to be haunted and consumed by this idea of the way women move through the world. But also, someone mentioned to me after reading the collection that it is grim. And I remember responding that grimness is a luxury afforded to people who don't live with this kind of violence every day. And so it is more than just a grim recollection of what has happened, but also a celebration of the resilience of women and the ways in which we heal. My work is always about truth-telling as a pathway to healing, the ways in which we heal, the ways in which we change form, we disappear into something new, we grow new teeth and new claws to fight back. I'm interested in joy as well as the hardship.
Thank you, thank you. I mean, speaking of witnessing, right? So your poem as sort of this way of bearing witness, you know, that something has happened here, and figuring out a way to make sure that it continues, to make sure that we continue, that we never forget it, right? It's got me sort of thinking about how archives are being built around this incident. So there's your poetry collection, Tricia, there is your gorgeous book, Buried Beneath the Baobab Tree. I remember reading the book around the time it came out, and I was struck by how human it was. That's also something that Titilope mentioned. How can you kind of go away from the abstractness of it, you know, to something that is more urgent and raw and present? And Tricia, Adaobi, I keep...
Either name is fine. Either name is fine. Right. They're both my names on my birth certificate.
It made me think about kind of how tricky it is to represent African pain and trauma, right? Because it's something that that has not always been done very well, right? In African literature, there is something called poverty porn, you know, where people just kind of talk about suffering in ways that end up dehumanizing the sufferers, that it's many a times honestly want to kind of give visibility to. But your novel doesn't do that. I mean, it's a YA novel, you know. It gives us girls who we connect to, you know, girls who are just living their lives, being girly in the way that girls are, being brave in the way that girls are, with a ton of ambition, right? With a community that loved them, a family that loved them, and then this tragedy hits. So were there any storytelling decisions you had to make in order to make sure that even in your conveying powerfully the tragedy, you still preserved the humanity of these girls and their communities?
Well, I think for me, it's not too difficult a thing to do to preserve their humanity, because I mean, it's just, I'm talking to the people. I'm not sitting in, you know, Wisconsin and writing about people in Chibok, you know. I'm meeting these people. I meet them. I laugh with them. I've slept in their houses. I mean, when I go to Chibok a lot, because especially in the earlier years of the incident, because the Nigerian military was preventing journalists from coming into Chibok. They actually would not let foreigners journalists, and even at the Borno State in Maiduguri, for example, all foreigners were stopped at the airport, and there was all that drama. So I had the advantage of being Nigerian. I'll conceal, I'll wear hijab, dress like the villagers, walking, because you had to step out of every vehicle coming into Chibok. Everybody had to disembark and walk through the gate while the military checked the vehicle and all that. So I would dress like them and move in. And because of that, returning to hotels and all was a bit complicated. So I would end up spending days in their houses. Wow. So I was simply writing the stories of people I saw. I didn't need to humanize or dehumanize. I just simply wrote try to communicate the stories of the people I had met and I had heard from. But the one decision I made when writing my book was to make my main character nameless. There is no name given to her because I wanted her to represent every one of the thousands of girls that have been kidnapped by Boko Haram. I know the world is fixated on Chibok and the Chibok girls, and I know they were symbolic. I know there was a lot of advantage to having them in the spotlight and then the whole Bring Back Our Girls campaign. But when I hear, especially international journalists, saying things like, the Nigerian government has done nothing. We have over 100 Chibok girls still missing. Nigerian government has done nothing. I find that I find it's really, it's a very painful comment, because I go to northeastern Nigeria and I see thousands of women and girls. When I say thousands, I'm not exaggerating. I've gone to camps, communities where everybody I look at was a captive of Boko Haram. Like I see women and girls gather in crowds, and they were all captives. Now, the Nigerian military, with all their faults, they have their many faults. I know that. The government has its many faults. We all know that. But I also know that they've brought back thousands of girls. I've seen these girls. I've spoken with these girls. So when I hear people saying the government has done nothing because over 100 Chibok girls are not back, I think it's a very painful thing. I find that comment very painful because it dismisses the girls, the importance of the girls who have returned. They may not be Chibok girls, but they are human. I've seen 12-year-old girls, 8-year-old girls who spent most of their lives in Boko Haram captivity. But because they're not Chibok girls, nobody cares about their health, their education. They're not getting free iPads and free laptops and all the sorts of things Chibok girls get. We have people from all over the world contacting us. Please, we want to see the Chibok parents, and they send thousands of dollars to them. That is happening. It is fantastic. I don't begrudge anyone their good luck. But then we must not dismiss the significance of the girls. Those girls' experiences, the ones who are not Chibok. So that's the main decision I made. Every girl who's been kidnapped by Boko Haram has to be represented in the story I'm telling. I'm telling the story of every girl and woman who's been a Chibok Boko Haram captive, a victim of Boko Haram, not just the Chibok girl. So that's a decision I made. In terms of humanizing them, it was just so natural to do. I was simply telling stories of people I know, people I had met, spent time with. So it was just easier, I guess, to tell their story exactly as it came across to me. I guess if I had dehumanized them, if there was anything dehumanizing about my contact with them, it would have reflected in my writing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, documenting this kind of event comes with a lot of responsibility, right? Just because for many people, that your book is probably might be the first and only place to which they're going to encounter the story. So the question of how we are archiving the stories are very important. And I mean, Titilope called it the Chibok brand, this kind of monolithic iconicity of that event that sort of drowns out, like you're mentioning, the more immediate manifestation or forms in which this violence plays out and the everyday heroisms that come out of it. I mean, I want to address this question to Mona, just because, you are very active on social media, and you have also used hashtags to publicize many of your positions and your interventions. And we know that the Chibok girls hashtag, the Bring Back Our Girls hashtag, was at some point a thing in the West. Everybody from Michelle Obama, Malala, Beyonce, even Kim Kardashian did something on it, But like Adaobi mentions, it was complicated, right? There are kind of there were ways in which, that may not have been the kind of heroic narrative that people try to circulate. And in fact, they were criticized at that point that there was something self-serving about the fact that this hashtag was being taken up by all these people. I mean, what do you think about, you know, hashtag activism, but also more broadly, social media itself as a space for bringing visibility specifically to violence against women? You've used it, it worked. What's your take on it?
So I'm a massive fan of social media. I live on Twitter. Anyone who knows me knows that I live on Twitter. And I have launched several things like hashtag Mosque Me Too, hashtag I beat my assaulter after I beat up a man who sexually assaulted me in a club in Canada, hashtag Dear Sister, when, you know, whenever I've been patronized and condescended to by fellow Muslim men, you know, I've used it for a variety of things. And obviously for me as an Egyptian, social media was also really important during the Egyptian revolution, which is now almost 10 years old. And, you know, we're coming up to January 25th. And if you go on Twitter and you do hashtag Jan 25, everybody immediately knows what you're talking about. So I'm a massive fan of social media, and especially as an Egyptian and an American, because in the United States, I see how social media has, or have generally, created a space and a platform specifically for Black, Indigenous, and women of color. Because we, and I insert myself here as a we, even though I have contributed to, you know, to various media, but generally, Black, Indigenous, and women of color, and then of course including queer women, trans women, non-binary people, disabled women, have not had access to major platforms in the way that white people have, specifically white men in the United States. So social media, and you see it with Black Lives Matter, for example, have been central to amplifying voices we don't usually hear. The fact that there is a Black-led revolution that continues in the United States, thanks to the work of 3 queer Black women who launched Black Lives Matter, you know, in 2013, 2014. Hashtag Me Too is thanks to the activism of a Black woman called Tarana Burke, who first used Me Too in 2006. Even though famous white Hollywood actresses, you know, when they started saying Me Too in 2017, everyone thought they invented it. So social media are really important to amplify voices that we don't usually hear. These are the voiceless, because no one is voiceless. And when we hear giving voice to the voiceless, we have to stop that and ask, why didn't we hear those voices? Because no one is voiceless. We didn't hear them because they were never given access, they were never heard, or they were actively prevented from these various platforms. But I think what is going on when we talk about the Chibok girls and bring back our girls and the kind of celebrity activism that you're talking about is very different from what I'm talking about. The celebrity activism is the kind of activism where someone puts on a t-shirt that says, this is what a feminist looks like, and hey presto, they're feminists. That's not what feminism is. Feminism, first of all, feminism is the destruction of the patriarchy, and it's fucking exhausting, and it's a daily act of defiance and disobedience and disruption. It's not putting on a t-shirt saying, this is what a feminist looks like. So I think what ends up happening is that thanks to celebrities, people pay attention, but these celebrities move on, and they're not touched in the least by these horrors that these issues are trying to give voice to and trying to amplify. And I think that especially for us who are daily fighting for the recognition of patriarchal violence against women and queer people, and women, girls, and queer people, we have to ask, what would happen if every day our news, which this is the kind of news and platforms now that marginalize so many of us, if every day the news were to cover the daily acts of terrorism that women, girls, and queer people were subjected to every day. If every day, every time a woman during the pandemic was beaten by an intimate partner, every time a girl had her genitals cut, every time a trans woman or a trans man was subjected to transphobic violence, if every day that was reported on the news, there would be no room left in the media to report anything else. And that's why when I answered your first question to me, I was saying that what happened to these girls and what happened to all the other girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram was something so horrific that we made room for it in our day-to-day life. But these horrors, and this is where social media comes in now, there are some of us who insist on as a daily practice on reminding the world that these horrors happen. Perhaps not to all of a sudden 270 girls at once, but they happen to a girl every minute. Just yesterday on Twitter, I cut and paste from a Guardian article about how rape and sexual violence are used against Dalit women in India. These are women who are on the lowest caste of the Hindu caste system. And gender-based violence is used against them as a way of punishing that most marginalized of castes in India, keeping them in their place, and forever reminding women and girls of that caste, but then also generally of who owns our bodies. And that would be the men who are on the top of the hierarchy. Just in reading that article and cutting and pasting it into a thread on Twitter, like Basit was saying earlier, it was incredibly traumatizing to read about, I'm sorry if this is going to trigger people, but to read about a 13-year-old girl raped and hanged from a tree. This happens every 20 minutes in India. A woman or girl is raped. Now, these figures are probably very similar across the world, but I'm talking about this one particular article. So this is where social media comes in. It is a daily act of ringing an alarm bell against patriarchy. It is saying, even if the media is going to ignore it because Beyonce isn't talking about it, even if I don't have space to talk about it because Michelle Obama is talking about something else, I insist on talking about it. And for me, I no longer write for the New York Times because I've decided to go independent, because I want to be able to talk about these things daily. And as a way of doing that, I've launched a newsletter, a feminist newsletter called Feminist Giant Newsletter. And this newsletter collects feminist news from around the world. And believe me when I tell you that it takes all my effort to ensure that it doesn't become a curation of rape stories from around the world. Because every day, every minute, there is an act of violence against a woman and a girl. And if it takes social media to ring that alarm, I will continue to ring that alarm on social media, because I insist that we pay attention, not just to the mass scale horrors, because those mass scale horrors are a reflection of minor daily horrors.
Right, yeah. I mean, Adaobi, just listening to Mona think about the significance of social media for creating visibility for this kinds of feminist issues, I'm wondering how social media as a media space is in opposition or stands in relationship to the kind of journalistic work that you do. Because it seems to me that there might be some connections, but also ways in which, in accounting for certain kinds of events, there is a social media way of information circulating. And then there is kind of what journalists on the ground are doing. And do you think that those two things are in opposition?
When I speak generally about the work I do, because I cover, I focus on various underreported humanitarian issues around Nigeria. And believe me, there are many. The horrors go beyond Chibok. So I don't think there's an opposition from social media. I don't think there's a problem. Social media helps, obviously. But when I speak about the Chibok situation, I speak specifically about that in terms of the disadvantages and the negative consequences. As I said, there were lots of positives. It got people interested, and the government did things they may not have done but there were also negative consequences. So what I think could happen is for people to look back and reflect on how it happened, the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, the social media campaign, and what could be done differently tomorrow. Because social media is relatively new in the world. It's less than 10, well, I'm not sure, 15 years or thereabouts that we. So it's just an opportunity to do things better the next time. Social media is great. It's a fantastic thing. It helps our work. Most of the time when I write about people and their issues, as I say, beyond Chibok, lots of help comes to them. I mean, I write about people who may be activists who've been dealing with really deep, troubling humanitarian issues with no help. And then you write about them, suddenly they get a grant from somebody in the US who, from some organization, and it moves their work forward. So in that way, social media has helped. But in the Chibok situation, especially with the Chibok case, I think there's an opportunity for us to look back at the way we handle things and think of how we could do things differently next time, because there will be another one tomorrow. Right. I look at things like, there's so many things I hear in the media. I mean, it's fantastic. We know that they kidnap girls, but a lot of people don't realize, for example, that the Chibok school is a mixed school. It's not just females, it's male and is mixed. There were male students as well, just that the male didn't spend the night, that night in the dormitory. So it's a mixed school. It wasn't like Boko Haram decided to attack girls. And secondly, it was completely accidental. Yes, Boko Haram had been kidnapping girls, as I've mentioned. They had been kidnapping girls more than a year before the Chibok kidnappings, but attacking that particular school was purely accidental.
How do you
But
mean?
the media, they did not plan. They were looking for food and they came to steal a piece of equipment. Haven't you heard that before? Mm-hmm. Okay. So they came looking for a piece of equipment. And then they encountered these girls in the dormitory and they said, they had an argument amongst themselves. I mean, old girls who have come back will tell you the story. They said, what do we do with these people? One of them said, why don't we lead them to their parents' homes, attack their, use the girls to gain access to their parents' homes, because the parents, live in Chibok town, take them to their parents' home and use the girls to access their parents' homes and loot, steal from the homes. Somebody else suggested, no, let's put them inside one of the dormitories and set them on fire, burn them down. So, and then a third person said, like the girls described, one small boy, that's the way they said it. So one of the young girls, they were really young people, not top militants, just, very little boys. One of the boys said, let us take them to Shekau, he will know what to do. And that was how the Chibok, the thing was birthed. So it wasn't premeditated. I know the media loves that story. Or these people sat down and decided it's an attack on girl education. I mean, we know, like Kassim said, Boko Haram has an issue with girl education. They want to have female slaves. But for the Chibok situation in particular, it was not premeditated. They did not go to disrupt the girls' education. It was purely accidental. Human Rights Watch has confirmed this in interviews they did with confirmed with interviews they did with the girls who escaped that night. I have spoken with Chibok girls who have confirmed it, told you of the conversations. Journalists from the Wall Street Journal have confirmed this. And so it's public knowledge, but the world is determined to hold on to this narrative of Boko Haram premeditated, go to a school and disrupt the girls' education. So we ignore the fact that it's a mixed school. It's not just the girls' school, it's male and female. So there were boys in that school, never mind that it's called Chibok Girls' School. It was a girls' school initially, but about 10 years ago, the government decided to put boys in it because of lack of space or something like that. And then we ignore the fact that they came looking for equipment and food to steal. So it was purely accidental. Yeah. Even though, of course, taking them to the forest is probably a better thing to have happened than setting them on fire, because they said that was the option the guys were going for until the little boy said, let us take them to Shekau, he will know what to do. So my point is that we have the opportunity to look back and think, what did we do wrong? What went wrong with this social media campaign? In what ways was it advantageous? In what ways did it backfire? What were the negative consequences? Look back, re-examine, and then when the next one comes, for it will surely come, we will know how to handle things differently. Because if you're going to go and do the same way, if we're going to handle it the same way we handled the previous one, we're going to be left with the kinds of problems we still have today. I can assure you those girls are finding it difficult to slide back into normal lives because of that Bring Back Our Girls campaign. It is difficult for them to live normal lives today. So how do we avoid that kind of thing, where the Nigerian government is terrified of anything happening to these precious girls, where Boko Haram insists that they stay with the commanders and they will never be found, that sort of thing. So let's reflect. find out in what ways the campaign went wrong and how it will be done differently tomorrow. That's all. But social media is great, fantastic, helpful most of the time.
Yeah. Abdulbasit.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Adaobi. That was very, very brilliant, the way you explained it. And I actually agree with some of your points, but then I also disagree with some of your points. I agree with your points on the fact that it's important for us to use the Chibok event as a learning experience, so that we'll be able to understand how to react in a more proactive way for future occurrence. But what I slightly disagree about is when you actually said that the incident was accidental. I think what was accidental in that particular incident is the global theme that that the old Chibok event. The reason I'm saying this is because 2 weeks before April 14, when these girls were kidnapped, Abubakar Shekau, he released a videotape where he actively spoke about engaging in slavery and taking girls to sleep. This was 2 weeks before the event. I actually translated this clip because what I started doing, I was curating all Boko Haram's releases, their audiovisuals, their audios, videos, poems, because Boko Haram also released poems as well. They're very they produce they have corpus of literary collection, from poems to what in Arabic is called nasheed, which is like nasheed is like maybe when but nasheed, I don't know how to put it probably in English. You're paused. You're
What's that?
Religious songs.
Oh yeah, religious songs, exactly. Religious songs. So 2 weeks before that event of Chibok, and you can actually check this out in the collection that I actually co-edited, the Boko Haram Reader. In that particular collection, Shekau, as he had even anticipated the kind of critique he would get. So he was even mentioning some certain scholars. He was saying that, well, this particular scholars, you people might say that there's no more slavery, there's still slavery. And mind you, this particular issue I'm actually speaking about was exactly what the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was exactly what they themselves picked upon and used to justify the enslavement of Yazidis, of the Yazidi women. So I'm not saying that. I think there's a whole lot of things that is actually complicated with about the Chibok event. I think in my own opinion, I might be wrong. I might be outrightly wrong. And I've actually spoken to some of the leaders of the. In fact, in 2018, I was on a panel at Kabefest at the Kaduna Book and Art Festival with the leader of the kidnapped Chibok girls, the parents, because they have an association. I was on a panel together with him, and I actually had extensive discussion with him. I might be wrong. I might be completely wrong. But what we saw is that this particular event, there were actually so many things that happened before that particular incident. Boko Haram might not necessarily have planned the way the whole event blew into global attention, which also shaped the way Shekau reacted in subsequent. I mean, for example, the Depchi kidnapping would not have actually occurred in that style it occurred, if not for the fact that they saw the way people reacted to Chibok. But there's evidence that Shekau himself.
You know, Abdulbasit, you're making the assumption that, remember that they had kidnapped girls even a week before. They had been kidnapping more than a year before the Chibok kidnapping. And guess what? It was their coming to the school was the second time Boko Haram attacked Chibok. It wasn't the first. So even if Shekau had made that comment 2 weeks before, bear in mind he had been consistently kidnapping girls more than a year before that school kidnapping. So you are right in saying he wants to kidnap, he wants to enslave, but it was already a culture. more than a year before the girls were kidnapped. That's my point. But that particular school kidnapping was not planned. He didn't plan to disrupt the education or anything like that. It was accidental. They had kidnapped girls from their weddings. Girls were at weddings and they kidnapped them from their weddings while they were getting married. Boko Haram stormed the venue, kidnapped the bride, her bridesmaids, and cleared. That had happened consistently. It was the second time they were attacking Chibok when they took the girls. So you see, you are right in that they planned to enslave, they planned to kidnap girls, but I'm talking about the Chibok kidnappings in particular. That attack on the school had nothing to do with attack on girl education. It had nothing to do with disrupting girls from going to school and all the narratives we latched onto. As much as those are things that Boko Haram believes in, that particular kidnapping was purely accidental. And then when Boko Haram saw the way the world responded, they latched onto it. It was their coup of a lifetime, and then it shot them into the limelight.
Yeah, actually,
I mean,
I agree with you on that point. And I would
Abdulbasit?
just final points of this. I actually agree with you on that with Adaobi, because even before the April 14 kidnapping, I mean, Boko Haram has been burning schools across.
Long before, yeah.
I mean, they've actually set some schools on fire. They've even told some parents that they should not send their children to schools anymore. So we've had this, they've been building on this incident, but the whole global attention that Chibok brought was actually what probably shaped the way they handled the kidnapping of the guy. I agree with you, Adaobi, on this, actually. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely interesting insight. And I will say that it actually even shows how it deepens how reprehensible it was, that it was an afterthought. So you can just, I mean, if they had this like crazy military strategizing to kidnap the girls, you know, in the ways that the public wants to imagine it, it would have been, it's one thing. But to say that, you know, a group of small boys marched into a school and it was, should we steal food, or should we steal equipment, or should we steal girls? It's like that just shows you the total pure exposure of people to violence, and particularly women in that context. I think this is a good point for us to open the floor for our creative writer to kind of take a few minutes to share some of their work, and then we are going to, after that, so begin to gather your thoughts. Once we are done with the poetry presentation and the reading from Adaobi's book, we are going to open the floor for questions. So start typing or start thinking about what you would like to ask. And let's start with Adaobi.
Okay. I thought Titi would go first. I have a very, very short chapter to read. The chapters in my book are very short. Now this one is just titled Inside the Sambisa. So battalions of Boko Haram men are everywhere, like ants in an anthill. Going, coming, sitting, standing, walking, chatting, praying, preaching, teaching, training. Their black flag, imprinted with white Arabic letters above and within a white circle, hangs almost as high as the tallest tree. Scores of vans and trucks and hundreds of motorbikes are parked in the bowels of the forest. Electricity generators churn, electrical equipment buzzes. Tarpaulin tents are sprawled from east to west. Strolling in and out of the shelters are not only Boko Haram men, but dozens of women and children as well. The women stare stealthily at us new arrivals from time to time, as if they are afraid to be caught looking. But no matter how hard we stare back, there is little of them to see. Their entire bodies are hidden inside mauve niqabs, which allows to see only their hands and flashes of their eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada. Titilope.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that just listening to the conversation between Abdulbasit and Adaobi highlighted for me the importance of telling these stories, and how even in that moment of negotiation, there's still a recognition that you can commodify the life of a girl, that it is currency. Even the young boy knew, let's take them and he will know what to do with them, while the girls kind of look on, waiting for their fate to be descended upon them. I think that actually is the larger takeaway from that conversation, whether it was accidental or not, becomes largely, semantical. So this is how we disappear. We fall backwards into our mothers' mouths, become them, become the only stories we've ever been told, stories about women who stay, women who endure, women who offer their bodies into the belly of the beast to protect their children. This is how we go missing. We tumble into a fist, bones beaten to pulp. We crumble beneath the weight of a man with a hole in his chest, and the vacuum takes us to a place where we are never enough, yet we are too much. Our mouths too big, our bodies too whole, too soft, too much like God. So the wolves come, dragging the screeching bodies of little girls from their childhoods, folding our hearts into their mouths. They find us at work, at school, knees bent at the altar or on the dance floor. Whether we are a shy whisper or a loud joy, whether we are hips moving free or too small to carry the weight of it. Sometimes they come with a stranger's whisper. Often they come with names that we know well. We call them uncle, call them brother, call them friend, call them on nights when the world feels too big. We ask for a shoulder to lean on, get a fist instead, claws that peel our bodies open like ripe fruit for the taking. And we try to forget, but we cannot forgive. We throw away our names, we shapeshift, we code switch, we find a new language for survival, teach it to our daughters too. But this time, we come back for our bodies, we come back for our voices, we gather the broken, gather the split and scattered. Anything that still has a pulse, even what is only a shadow of itself, is still worth loving. All that we paid for in our blood, let it come, let it move with only the skin on its back. We do not look back, we do not turn to salt. This time we are the ocean, come to reclaim everything that belongs to us and swallow anything that refuses to be moved. Ask about us, these women who reinvented joy, who snap back our broken bones to the rhythm of a survival song, a song about the audacity of living and loving anyway. We become a whole new kind of creature, something fearless and fierce, something bold enough to call down even lightning and dare it to touch us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much to the panelists for this exhilarating conversation, the exchanges, the just new perspective that each of you brought to this question, to the story of these girls and the questions that we're asking. Thanks a lot, Adaobi and Abdulbasit. That was really cool to just hear you guys kind of think through that really complicated issue. So the floor is open for questions. You can either, I think you can either type your questions into the chat, or you can speak. You can simply, oh, actually there are two questions already. Okay. Jacqueline Bethel Mogwe says, thank you to all the panelists for sharing their thoughts on the complex perspectives on the Chibok schoolgirls kidnapping. There has been much conversation about the global response to the kidnapping. I wonder if the panelists might comment a bit more on the resonance of the campaign. Continentally, beyond Nigeria, I think neighboring Cameroon, where the campaign inspired a similar campaign, Bring Back Our Boys, and has similarly inspired Cameroonian literature on the subject matter. So the question is kind of gesturing towards, can we think about it beyond Nigeria in terms of the region and also in terms of the continent? And let me just take two questions and throw it out there, and the panel can kind of dig their teeth into it. Thank you. This is from Anu. Thank you for a much spirited discussion and a great learning opportunity. My question is for Adaobi. If the kidnapping was purely accidental, why did they not go to a boys' school, for example? I disagree that the attack was not gendered. It has become commonplace to attack girls over boys. I mean, we've kind of addressed this already, but Adaobi, if there's anything you want to add to that, feel free. Yeah, that's where we are right now.
I'll just quickly respond to the question from Anu, if that's okay.
Okay. Sure.
So the quick thing I'll say is Boko Haram attacked a school in Buniyadi, northeastern Nigeria, in February 2014. They kidnapped the Chibok girls in April 2014. Now, guess what they did in February 14? When they went to the school, they slaughtered 40 boys in their dormitory. 40 students were slaughtered in their dormitory by Boko Haram. The world did nothing. Nigeria didn't think, the Nigerians didn't think it was worth making a hashtag about. And so I'm not going to focus on the pain that brings to me, because I know this is a conversation about women and violence against women. So I'll keep my thoughts about that to myself. But then just bear in mind, I knew that 40 boys were slaughtered in their dormitory in Federal Government College, Buniyadi, in February 2014, 2 months before the Chibok kidnappings that got the whole world into a frenzy. So that's my simple answer to that, in addition to everything else I can see.
Titilope, I know that you actually write about that incident. And Adaobi, thank you for bringing it up. So amidst this text that is very centered on thinking violence against women, I always found that poem just it's about boys, you know, and you're telling the story of violence, and it sticks out, you know. And I've always, when I get to it, it's a different moment, you know. So why did you want to capture that story? What was it that made you think, look, that story has to be told as well?
So that was an argument with the editor and the publisher as well, because it is very much a story about boys.
Yeah.
But it was just, I have two reasons. One, because it was something so horrific, but also so related to the rest of the text that I couldn't live with myself if that poem didn't live within that larger context. I think for the section of the collection where that poem sits, it's also the section where I included this poem that I performed at the inauguration of the president. All of these things exist because I wanted to set a tone for the national disappointment that was happening, or the hope leading up to that moment, the ways in which people went out to vote, people were excited about this new leadership, and the ways in which we were failed by that leadership. So there are poems within the collection that feel separate, but are, to me, a part of the whole conversation around failed leadership, lack of communication, and the ways in which our lives as a whole are not valued. And I wanted all of those things to sit in conversation with each other. So while it appears that it doesn't have anything to do with the girls in Chibok, as we've mentioned, this was an event that happened before that. And all of these things, to me, create this domino effect that gets us to where we are now.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, it's history is so complicated, and I think that's the joy and the beauty of being able to create spaces where we can actually walk through the complexities, right? Because the Chibok Girls event has become iconic, right, as a kind of feminist event, right? And which it needs to be, right? Because, you know, it's coming from a culture of particularly undervaluing women's lives, right? But it's good to know that history is always complex, and that the kind of this search for some kind of language that can articulate the truth of what really happened involves thinking about it in all its complexities. And there's a way that the story about that boy, those boys, kind of interrupts any simple, easy, one-way, black-white account of that narrative. And I feel like we have to hold on to those moments when history just kind of stops us in our tracks and say, no. There are these other things that we have to think about. There is a question from Pami. Thank you for this most important panel discussion. I also wonder how we can educate boys and men about the value of women to help break the perpetuated cycle of paternalistic rule. Also, these young boys who are being forced into these groups as soldiers, how are they being freed and rehabilitated? Is it an important aspect we need to think about? So I think this might be a good question for Mona, just because you have thought about the idea of how do we re-engineer minds? How do we make people think differently in fundamental ways that can shape the way we exist in the world in terms of gender? And maybe Abdulbasit could also contribute to what the other half about what the military practice of Boko Haram is and whether these boys are being rehabilitated.
Right. I think the heart of this question, or the heart of the answer rather, and that connects to the question, is making sure people understand the danger of patriarchy. And when I talk about patriarchy, the textbook definition of patriarchy is a system of oppressions that privileges male dominance, but it doesn't privilege all men. And I think this is where people sometimes misunderstand and stereotype women as man haters. I'm not a feminist because I hate men. I'm a feminist because I want to destroy the patriarchy. And there are women who benefit from the patriarchy, and there are men who are hurt by the patriarchy. And one of the primary ways that patriarchy hurts men and boys is through the socialization of men and boys into those system of oppressions, in that it teaches them violence, in that it teaches them that emotions and love and all these so-called girly things, anything that is connected to emotions and girls is considered an insult, because the very being of a girl is considered the weakest and the worst thing that you could be, because the girl is at the bottom of the societal hierarchy according to patriarchy. So I think the best thing to tell boys and men is to insist that they understand that patriarchy hurts them too. Patriarchy actually really only benefits very rich, very able-bodied, very conservative, very heterosexual, and a particular age of a man. It doesn't benefit everybody, but because it promises men, whether they're men in government or men in military or men at home, that if they continue to uphold the tenet of patriarchy, they can then be on top of the social ladder when it comes to women and girls. So I call this a trifecta of misogyny, where it's the state oppresses everyone, but the state and the street and the home together oppress women and girls. And this is where the state recruits men and boys. It says to them, if you continue to uphold patriarchy, we will allow you to oppress women and girls. And so you get this hierarchy of oppression. But in the case of Boko Haram, in the case of, we heard, Abdulbasit mentioned ISIS, we call them Daesh in Arabic. I'm glad he did. And so many other armed militant groups. They recruit men, and they recruit men and boys with the promise of something. And what is that promise? The promise is usually something enacted on the bodies of women and girls. But if you peel that back, what harm does patriarchy then subject those boys and men to in order to get this so-called reward? And I think this is where we have to remember that boys were kidnapped. We have to remember that boys are recruited. We have to remember that in the service of patriarchy, we end up dehumanizing men and boys for whatever reward patriarchy has promised them. So I think to cut, this is my long, complicated, because I write books about this stuff, and this is not always something that fits into the space of a tweet, but we have to remind men and boys that patriarchy harms them too. And feminism is not the hatred of men. Feminism is the destruction of patriarchy. And I believe that when we destroy patriarchy, we liberate us all. That's why I say I don't want to be equal to men, because men are not free. I want to be free. And this, I think, is where we bring men and boys into the conversation and ask them, don't you too want to be free of the violence that patriarchy conscripts you to?
Thank you. Abdulbasit?
Okay, that was actually brilliant. Thank you for that excellent presentation. the only addition I would love to add on this is it's also very important for us to understand that beyond the unfortunate incidents at Buniyadi, there's so many other young boys who are being conscripted. There's a high level of conscription actually going on within the Boko Haram movement. Some of this, there's so many factors that draw people, some of these young boys are being conscripted into Boko Haram. Some of it is forceful conscription. Some of it is also because of the human rights abuses of the Nigerian military. So for example, for some of the young boys whose parents have been treated badly by the Nigerian army in the course of fighting against Boko Haram, some of these young boys have that vengeance and revenge emotion in them. And the only way they believe they can actually discharge that emotion is by joining Boko Haram. And then there's also that transcendental notion of reward, like, oh, if you join this group, there's some heavenly rewards that you're going to have. And then there are also other people who are joining some of this, who are joining the group on the basis of economics. Economics in the sense that some of these people are already criminals, they're already engaging in all forms of crime, but then they're now being convinced that instead of you doing this crime in this way, you can add religious garb and religious paraphernalia, to this crime you've been committing. So because of that, I mean, people join through this way as well. Now, when it comes to re-engineering society, I think it's very important for us to look at societal values. I mean, I look at Borno State, for example. I won't deny the fact that there's been all forms of deprivation against the female gender. Deprivation in terms of education, in terms of access to power, in terms of, I mean, personally for me, I feel so irritated when I see religious scholars speaking about the female body without the female voice in it. And I'm always like, when I see religious scholars, for example, speaking about menstruation, I'm like, you don't have a voice in this. Women are supposed to be the ones speaking about this because you as a man, you don't experience menstruation. So why should you position yourself in that space of authority to speak about something that you have no clue about? Like your biology does not give you that authority to speak about it. So I always believe that it's important to bring women into spaces where they can be much more vocal. But the honest truth is that we've had this culture where women are very vocal, where women have actually contributed to the society. It's just unfortunate that the society has been going through a lot of like retrogression, even in our cultural values. I mean, we've had situations where, for example, within the Hausa Muslim culture, there's a group of women known as the Eltahawy. The Eltahawy are scholars, women scholars who actually champion women's rights within the cultural value of the society. They speak about women issues, they're very vocal about women issues. So some of this group of women have always been there. We've had this women that are speaking, but unfortunately, the ability of this, the voices of these women have also been silenced as well by the patriarchal value of the society, and we could even see that, for example, even during the Our Me Too movement, for example. I mean, as much as no matter how critical one can be about the Our Me Too movement, I mean, they were actually voicing out something that is very, very important, something that is very basic, which is the signing of the VAP Act, into law, which will actually prevent gender-based violence. This was something that the society as a whole ought to have taken as a responsibility. But then we saw the backlash. We saw the way the women that came out to speak about the Our Me Too. We saw the way that the society actually reacted to them. And lastly, this is something I would also love to chip in. Lastly, I think when negotiating for values in society, I think it's very important to understand the kind of vocabulary we are actually using in speaking about this issue. And when I mean vocabulary, I mean, I personally pay a lot of attention to language because language actually shapes the way a society reacts to issue. I will give you a very good example. A part of my long-term research has been on the research on gender and sexuality, subhearten sexualities in northern Nigeria. I gave a presentation on that topic last month at Northwestern University where I spoke about the subhearten sexuality.
Abdulbasit, we have 7 minutes left, and I would like us to take one more question. So if you could kind of wrap things up.
In a nutshell, the language, what I mean by language is, for example, I mean, there's often that backlash when people speak about feminism or global feminism in northern Nigeria. And the reason is because it's always conceived as this is an imported Western canon that is being forced on colonized society. So it's been roped into this Orientalist discourse of Edward Said and all of this vocabulary. But I actually believe that when women localize their vocabulary, when they actually use vocabulary that are within that society, most times there's less backlash. A very good example of that in the subject of sexuality, for example, anybody will come out in northern Nigeria to speak about LGBT, there's always backlash. But the moment you speak about Yendaudu, there's no backlash. I mean, the moment you use the word Yendaudu, nobody really complains. Everybody says, we know Yendaudu of that. But the moment you use LGBT, there's always that reactionary, LGBT. But the moment you use Yendaudu, which is almost the same thing, it's just the balance and the vocabulary that is different. So that's what I have to say on that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just one last question. And we have 6 minutes left. So I invite every panelist to respond to this question as briefly as they can. And it's from Anu. The theme of the discussion centers on, and by the way, there are lots of amazing questions here, and they're just questions that we have to unpack. So sorry that we are not having the time to address all of them. And this question says, do Chibok girls get to use literature to heal, or how can we connect with the girls through literature? And is there a way that we can maybe extend this question just into how can we use our various work as documenters either of this event or as just a history of violence? How can we use our work as archivists to kind of initiate a space of healing? And you can just respond to it however you like to.
Okay, let me just go on. Let me just say something on that briefly. Can I go ahead?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, I think what is important for beyond the poetic composition that people like Titilope excellently executed, and beyond the works of Adaobi, I think it's very important to curate the victim's narrative as a depository. It's very important to curate their narrative. The voices of the victim of this violence is all over the place. It's scattered, so we don't really have a curation. When I started working on Boko Haram Reader, the Boko Haram Reader was actually a curation of the Boko Haram ideas from their own words, so that people can understand them from their own words. And because there's a lot of things that people think about Boko Haram, but then the leaders and the followers of the group, they have a body of production that they are using to explain themselves to the world. So putting all of that together has actually helped in understanding the group. And I think we need that as well, a similar curation for the victims of the violence. So far, I've only seen literature on poem, like prose composition, but the curation of the victim, I've seen it as well. I mean, Ellen Abila did a very good job, but bringing the voices of these girls together, as raw as it is, without any filters, I think is very important, because it will be an important archive that like in the future, people can always look back to it to understand what really happened during that time. So, for example, all the personal interviews you had, like Adaobi, for example, all the personal interview you had with the parents, with the girls themselves when they came back, like the all issues that Titilope raised, what happened when they left Missy, what happened when they returned, all of those narratives, I think it's important to curate them as in a compilation, maybe a book or something, you know, but I've not seen that so far.
So I wanted to comment on that very briefly. I think it's important for me to tie back to what Adaobi said about the opportunity to look back and then look forward and think about the ways in which that situation was managed. I think when we talk about failed leadership, this is one of the things that comes up. So the question is really about how can the girls access literature as a tool for their own healing? And there's no way for us to really know what happened in the after for these girls, other than being shut off in a school where they become aliens in their own home. I think if we had it to do over, we might have approached this with a way that centers their own priorities, their own healing, versus the perception from the rest of the world, or this imminent danger that they exist in, whether they're locked up in a school or not, and to allow them to lead the ways in which they want their stories to be told, and to give them the tools to tell those stories, whether it's a compilation, whether it's a memoir, whether it's one poem, one sentence. I don't think, I'm not a historian or authority on this, but I do not think that the girls were given an opportunity to access healing in any way, shape, or form. And this after that I'm obsessed with, this what is their life now, is something that is difficult to let go, because you wonder if this kind of captivity does as much damage, if not worse, than the original captivity. So I don't know that I have a direct answer to that question, other than it is, again, an illustration of how women and girls do not get a say, even in their own healing process.
I mean, I think what Titi has just said is so, it's so important, because most of the time when we discuss Boko Haram victims like the Chibok girls, we always have an idea of what happened to them, what should happen to them, what we think should help them healing. But hardly does anyone ask the girls what they want, because half the time you realize that what we want for them is not what they want for themselves. The girls will tell you, for example, many of the girls don't want to return to school. That's just what they will tell you. Auntie, I want to go out. You're not the one begging them. But the government is paid so much to keep them, and they don't want to be in school. Some of them, not all. So they go back on holidays, and some of them refuse to return, or some of them do silly things, like one of them slapped a teacher and was expelled. You know, things like that. Nobody asks them. Nobody asks them, what do you think about your experience being married to Boko Haram? I mean, beyond the Chibok girls now, the girls who say they were married to commanders, some girls say, I had a great time in the forest. I actually would have preferred to be there than return to my parents. And everybody says they're suffering from, Stockholm syndrome. Nobody just wants to sit down and listen to the girls. Sometimes the girls say, I was never raped. And then somebody says, but you were, somebody will tell them, but you're a child at your age. Once a man sleeps with you, even when you were married, he raped you. You know, and the girls are insisting, Auntie, I was not raped. And somebody else is it's forcing them to accept that they were. So I understand. I know that we have all these global standards, expectations, and the intentions to do good. But I think it's also important to listen to the girls, hear what they want for their lives, their perception of their experience, irrespective of what anybody around the world thinks of the experiences. Let them tell you how they found it. To me, it's so horrible to be in the forest, locked up with strange, bound to strange men. But for some of them, it was not a big deal. I'm not saying it's right. No, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, let's listen to them. Find out what they think about their experiences. Find out what they want to do with their lives, and subsequent to their kidnapping, after now they're back. Instead of always prescribing and defining and telling them what should happen and telling them what, that kind of thing. At least listen to them, hear from them first. And I've seen very little of that happen in the years since the girls have been returned, especially the Chibok girls. Very little listening has happened, but people constantly imposing what they feel is good for the girls.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Mona, do you have any contributions?
I think my contribution is kind of like a summary of everything I've heard, because I've learned so much from my fellow panelists, and I'm really grateful and I appreciate very much all their various inputs. And again, I'm honored as an Egyptian to be a part of this, because I come to this as a feminist, and in my head, I keep thinking about what Ado said about how the girls now are as confined as they were when they were first kidnapped. And this just makes me, so first of all, it's very telling that some girls wanted to stay in the forest. So that makes me wonder just how free were they to begin with? And secondly, this idea that the government is basically holding them captive to protect them, this idea of protection. Now, when I said earlier, I want something much bigger than equality with men, because men are not free. When I started #MosqueMeToo, it was in reaction to Muslim women being sexually assaulted during Hajj pilgrimage and in sacred spaces. And when I started #IBeatMyAssaulter after I beat up a man who sexually assaulted me in a club, in both of these instances, men entered the conversation that I began and said things like, we have to protect our sisters. And I said, whoa, 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 hold on now. I don't want protection, because protection is conditional, because protection is only given to the good, and protection is immediately withdrawn as soon as you're considered bad. And the club manager, when I beat up this man in Montreal, Canada, he came to ask me, why did you beat up this man? And he pointed to my partner, my beloved, and he said to me, he asked me, why didn't you let your husband take care of it? So I said to him, and this is my conclusion to all of this, I said, first of all, he's not my husband. And second of all, this is my body. I take care of it. So this idea of protection, who is protected? Who is offered protection? Where do we feel free, and where are we freest? Because if a girl tells you she was freer with her kidnappers than she was with her family, and then she is now under government protection, this tells me, fuck the patriarchy, which is how I began and how I end everything I say.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you to this panel. You guys were glorious. Just the amount of insights that were shared today. And I mean, this is what we had in mind in curating it the way it did, because each of you are coming from it from all these different places. And we just knew that, you were going to bring a sort of different kinds of insights to the question, and you did not disappoint. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. I hope that we can continue this conversation. I hope everyone here today got something out of this. And the event was recorded, and we're going to we're going to edit and cut up pieces that we'll share on social media at a later date. So keep an eye out for those content. Thank you to our hosts, Aliyah and her team, and Professor Kodesh. Thank you so much, guys. You were awesome.